so good for David, and then it took a dramatic turn for the worse. His son, Absalom, rebelled against him, set in motion a plan to usurp the throne from David. So, fearing the worst, David and his loyal followers fled the city. At the end of 2 Samuel chapter 15, where we left off, remember I said it was a cliffhanger, David is on the run. He is seriously grieving the drama that has just exploded in his family. And the last thing he does is he sends one of his trusted advisors, a gentleman named Hushai, to go back to Jerusalem and pretend to serve Absalom, his son. And in the process, Hushai is essentially going to be a secret agent who is going to try to undermine the rebellion. And that brings us to 2 Samuel chapter 16. Turn to page 253 if you're reading from one of the Bibles in your pew. 2 Samuel chapter 16, page 253. I'm going to try and study 5 chapters today. I think this is the record for what I've ever done before. So I'm going to summarize. I'm not going to be reading. We probably would just be reading if that's all we were doing today. The other thing with 5 chapters is I'm going to try and bring together multiple storylines. You're going to meet a lot of different people in this, just like Kurt said. Friends, co-workers, family members of David, who all enter into the drama. And the question that I want us to observe is, what is a good friendship? How do the people who demonstrate friendship to David act? How do they think? And in the process, to try and apply that question to ourselves, am I a good friend? What does it mean to be a good friend? We all have friends in our lives. And how are we actually expressing ourselves as friends? Do the people in our lives think of us as good friends? The first storyline in chapter 16, verse 1, is that David and his entourage are rushing away from the city, and one of those friends or acquaintances appears, a man named Ziba. Do you remember him? No, we barely referenced him last week, just a little bit. Ziba was a steward of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth was the son of David's best friend, Jonathan. In 2 Samuel chapter 9, we learn that David wanted to honor his covenantal friendship with Jonathan. They had basically made a covenant that said, our families will be friends for life. And so David asked if there was anyone in the nation from King Saul's family, his predecessor. David wanted to bless someone. And that was out of King Saul's son, Jonathan's family, his best friend. It was Mephibosheth. They found that this guy was alive. And so David reached out to him and blessed Mephibosheth with land. And he allowed Mephibosheth to come and eat at his dinner table every single day. And so Mephibosheth went from being this person who was on the outskirts to being one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country. Overnight, he gets all of this land and is able to eat at the king's table. And we learned that because Mephibosheth was lame, it was his steward, Ziba, and his family who cared for all the land. And it's that guy, Ziba, who shows up to meet David as David is fleeing the city. So, David's in desperate need at this point. No longer is David the generous king who is blessing Mephibosheth and blessing Ziba. David's on the run, fearing for his life. How's Ziba going to act now? Well, we learn that Ziba brings food and animals for David and his entourage to care for them in this desperate moment. When David asks, where's Mephibosheth? Ziba tells David that Mephibosheth has actually stayed in Jerusalem hoping that the kingdom will be restored to him. Now, how about that for Mephibosheth? I'm going to get that word so wrong. Repaying David for his kindness. Instead, Mephibosheth betrays David. And upon hearing that, David immediately says to Ziba, all that land I gave Mephibosheth, I'm now taking it away from him and I'm giving it to you. So that's our first encounter with friendship. David sees one friend, Ziba, faithful, another friend, the son of his best friend, betrayed. Now we come to another story. David and his entourage continue fleeing, and they come across another man, Shimei. Shimei is from the same clan as King Saul, meaning someone who maybe has a negative impression of David because David became king rather than King Saul's family. So he starts throwing stones at David. He starts cursing him out. Imagine the humiliation David is feeling at this particular moment. First of all, David's own son is overthrowing him and rebelling against him to the point where this once great king now has to flee the city for his life, and he's got a few guards around him. And just then, this one solitary man comes up to them and starts flinging rocks at them and cursing them. Now I wonder, what do you think is the furthest you can throw a stone? Maybe the size of a golf ball. How far do you think you can fling it? Maybe about a football field. That would be a pretty good throw, I would think. I don't know. What I'm getting at is, Shimei is not that far away. It's not like he's launching these rocks at David from a mile away. He's pretty close. He's bold. One of David's longtime faithful generals who is surrounding David at this point, a guy named Abishai, here's another friend. You know what he says? David, let me go cut his head off to stop this nonsense. David says no. And here we see David's heart. He's right in the middle of one of the worst situations in his life, and David chooses not to engage the ridiculousness of this guy, Shimei. We actually read in the text, David describes it as abuse almost, that God is probably telling Shimei to do this. He just takes it. It's a sad, sad scene. The great king humiliated. So, we've got a couple issues here with friends. We see some betrayal. We see some loyalty. But imagine the low that David is feeling at this moment. Who can he trust? Who are his friends? Is he going to make it through the next day? Well, his entourage finally reaches their destination outside the city and they can have a little bit of peace. Meanwhile, the storyline changes its scene. In verses 15 through 19 of 2 Samuel chapter 16, we learn about what is happening with Absalom, David's son, who is rebelling against him. He ends up taking the throne in Jerusalem while David is fleeing the city. Now remember I said one of the last things that David did was to send his loyal advisor Hushai as a secret agent back to the city. We now read what happens. Hushai starts to undermine Absalom, faithful to David. First, Absalom seeks advice from another man, a man that is considered to be one of his wisest officials, a guy named Ahithophel. Ahithophel's advice was so good, he had such a good reputation that people said it was as though his advice came straight from the mouth of God. And Ahithophel has two pieces of advice for Absalom. The first is shocking, and it refers to David's concubines. Concubines were women who were potentially like second-tier wives. They might have actually been, in some cases, sexual slaves. And when David fled the city, he left his concubines there in the city to take care of the palace. Little did he know how that decision would backfire. Ahithophel advises Absalom to sleep with his father's concubines. And here's how Ahithophel explains it. He says, then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself obnoxious to your father, and the hands of everyone with you will be more resolute. So, in other words, if Absalom is to go through with this advice, it would send an unmistakable signal to the entire nation that Absalom truly has become king. So, Absalom does it. And to make sure that that signal is loud and clear, Absalom sets up a tent on the roof of the palace where everyone can see what is happening, and he sleeps with 10 concubines in plain sight. As if things were not broken already, this wicked act makes it clear that Absalom has no desire to reconcile with his father. It's brutal. And then Ahithophel has his second piece of advice. To finally put an end, in case there was any question who is king, he says, Absalom, your father and his followers are in a very weak and vulnerable position. Muster 12,000 soldiers and immediately attack them. But only kill David. Don't kill anyone else. And you will find that everyone else will turn in allegiance to you. I don't know totally what Absalom was thinking at this point, but from a military strategic standpoint, this is a very good plan. What Ahithophel is saying is, go in decisively, with overwhelming force, capture only David, so that the people know you're not out to just slaughter a whole bunch of people, you just want to finish off your father, and they'll rally around you. This was really good advice. Ahithophel is like a mastermind, trying to work the total makeover of the kingdom. But where Absalom is okay, for some reason, in sleeping with his father's concubines, he starts to have some misgivings about actually killing his father. And so he summons Hushai for a second opinion. And remember, Hushai was the guy that came in as David's secret agent. Absalom doesn't know that. He doesn't know that Hushai is still loyal to David. And Hushai says, Ahithophel's plan is terrible. It wasn't terrible. But Hushai has some logic to what he's saying. He says, Absalom, this is terrible because David and his men are seasoned fighters. He's right. David was a warrior king. The people who were still loyal to David were all seasoned warriors. And Hushai says, the whole plan is going to fall apart if David and his men actually fight back harshly and inflict damage on your soldiers. Your soldiers will lose heart and they will betray you. And so Hushai advises Absalom, don't do what Ahithophel says. Don't try to attack your father David. You need to wait until you can actually gather a much larger force and have overwhelming victory so that there's no contest. This passage starts to remind me a little bit of a spy novel, like when a CIA operative goes undercover and they try to infiltrate a foreign government. You notice what Hushai is doing? He's using fear and doubt to motivate Absalom. Fear is such a powerful motivator. And it works. In verse 14 we read that the Lord frustrated the strategically wise advice of Ahithophel, and Absalom chooses to wait. And with that one piece of advice, Hushai has won the entire battle. Well, the narrative continues in kind of that spy novel genre in verses 15 and the rest of the chapter. Hushai, once he learns that Absalom has trusted him and is going to wait, he sends 2 people undercover to go tell King David. But they get spotted by one of Absalom's men. And so Absalom sends men out to try and capture these 2 people as they're on the run to go and inform David. And when they realize that they've been spotted, they go to the nearest home and they hide down inside the well. Put a cover on the well. The men from Absalom show up at the house, knock on the door, and are asking the owner of the house, where are they? Where are the 2 spies? And the owner of the house lies to the men and is faithful to David. When the coast clears, they come up out of the well and they take off and they go inform David of what's going on. Back in Jerusalem, when Ahithophel, remember he's the wise advisor, he's the one who actually had the really solid plan to destroy David and take over. When he finds out that Absalom did not take his advice, it's like he sees the writing on the wall. One scholar I read suggested that Ahithophel knew that Absalom was now doomed. He knew that David would return to power, that this delay would give David the time he needed to muster a force in order to overcome Absalom. And when David returns to power, what's going to happen to the people who were in league with Absalom? Ahithophel wisely believes David's going to come in and punish or kill everyone who betrayed him. And so rather than prolong the inevitable, Ahithophel hangs himself right then and there. This is a crazy story, right? At the end of at the conclusion of chapter 17, then, war is in the air. And it is a war of father versus son. David and his men versus Absalom and his men. And we learn that as Absalom is gathering his military from the tribes of Israel, David and his men are hungry. They've been on a run. They're in a position of serious disadvantage. And if we stop the narrative right there, it seems like this war is shaping up to be an absolute decimation of David and his forces. But as we continue reading into chapter 18, we're back to the storyline featuring David. And we learned in that chapter that David actually has had time to gather an army, and it's not small. He appoints commanders over thousands and hundreds. In fact, in verses 2 through 4, we learn that David wants to go out and fight with them, but he's an older man now, and his commanders say, absolutely not. And he relents, but he says one thing: please be gentle with my son Absalom. David is confident at this point. He's had time to gather his forces, and he believes that he and his men can actually win. And now David's story and Absalom's story come together in a massive eruption. It's a battle. It's a lot like one of our own Civil War battles. The text tells us that 20,000 people died that day as the two sides face each other. And David's army was victorious. In verse 9, though, we read that Absalom and David's men come together while Absalom is fleeing for his life. And he decides he's got to get out of there or else David's men are going to capture him. And so he takes off on a mule. But in his fear, in his emotion, he's not watching where he goes, and he rides right into a tree with low-hanging branches and actually gets caught in the branches while the mule rides out from under him. And he's hanging there in midair, unable to move. And then one of David's men, as he was witnessing all of this, goes back to the commander of David's army, Joab, and reports, "We found Absalom." Joab then goes and defies David's wishes. Remember, David said, "I want you to treat my son gently." Joab takes 3 javelins and thrusts them into Absalom's heart and kills him. And with that, the war is over. But the drama is far from over. Are you noticing how different friends are responding in this situation of emotion? Some are loyal, some are faithful, but some are betraying David. Some are ignoring his wishes. Messengers run to tell David the news of Absalom's death, and when he learns, he starts crying and weeping with all his might, saying, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you." And here we see David, the emotional parent. I mean, think about it. The war is over. The rebellion is over, but David has lost his son in the process. Even when our children are difficult, even when they cause us pain, we still don't want harm to come to them. And sometimes then we think we'd rather have the harm come to us than them, and that's exactly what David is feeling. He's just wrecked. And so the story continues in chapter 19 as David's army commander, Joab, the very man who killed Absalom against David's wishes, he sees David weeping and mourning loudly for his son, and he can't believe it. Why is David weeping for Absalom? Remember last week's story about the family drama? It was Absalom who killed David's firstborn son, Amnon. It was Absalom who has now schemed and stole the throne from David and led to the civil war and 20,000 people dead. It was Absalom who slept with David's concubines. Joab can't believe the king is behaving this way. In fact, Joab believes that the king's behavior of this weeping and mourning loudly for his son is so wrong that David is in danger of actually losing the support of his army. And so Joab boldly says in 2 Samuel 19, starting at verse 5, David, today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. You've made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on from your youth till now. Can you imagine talking to the king like that? He's crazy bold. What if David has a bad reaction to Joab? He is, after all, grieving his son at this moment. And remember who killed Absalom? The guy who's now confronting him about it. Almost certainly David had to know that. Kind of wonder, is Joab wise here? Is he courageous? Is he really reckless? Maybe he's recklessly courageous? I don't know. More to the point, is he right? Is David's loud wailing about losing his son going to have negative ramifications in this progress, this really touching moment for David to take the throne back? How would you react in that moment? What would you do when you're in leadership? Or maybe it's at your job. But in your personal life, it feels like things are just falling apart. Maybe you're sad. You're discouraged. That's David. This is an absolute mess. How is he going to react to Joab's strong confrontation? Look at verse 8. It says, the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told, the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him. Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. Now that might sound like a bit of a vague description of what is even going on there, but what the author is trying to tell us is that Joab's words worked. They turned the king to realize that he did need to stop this weeping, even though he was deeply hurting. And he did need to go out and be with his troops. And they came and rallied around him. So there's a sense in which if David had continued that loud weeping and mourning, the soldiers could have perceived it as David being very discouraging and ungrateful to them. Word was probably getting out amongst the soldiers. Like, what is our king doing here? It could seem as though he was unhinged, out of his mind. Joab was right. The soldiers could easily have thought David is no longer fit for leadership. He's broken. So, by coming out to the gate, David was showing gratitude. He was showing support for his men. And as they paraded before him, more than likely, he was thanking them and encouraging them. And so at this moment, it seems like David does have a change of disposition. It seems like Joab did get through to him. And that's perfect timing because this nation is hurting. They have just had this mini civil war erupt among them. The nation has seen the brokenness in the royal family. 20,000 soldiers have been killed. If that would have happened in the United States, this would be massive, massive news, right? It would be for any country. So it is a viable question. Okay, David has survived all of this, but is he weakened in his body, in his emotion, in his mind? And is he weakened in the hearts and minds of the people that maybe he can't be king anymore? Can he recover from this? Well, let's look and see how David responds. As we continue in 2 Samuel chapter 19, starting in verse 9, we read a few words as David lays the groundwork to return to Jerusalem and return to the throne. In verse 13, he chooses a new general, a gentleman named Amasa. It's interesting, this choice. Amasa had actually been part of Absalom's rebellion. And he chooses him over his longtime faithful general Joab. But perhaps this is wise on David's part. He's extending an olive branch to the enemy, so to speak. And in that, he is enacting a reunification. This is an act of peace. Also, his top general Joab has always had a bit of a devious side. Remember, it was Joab who killed Absalom, his son. It was Joab who strongly confronted David. Perhaps David is thinking, I need to rein Joab in. And so perhaps by choosing Amasa to replace Joab as the top general, David is addressing the problems he sees in Joab. In verses 14 through 18, then, David, his household, and many others head back to Jerusalem. And some figures return. Remember how we met Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth? How Ziba had come out to help David when David was on the run by giving him food and transportation. And then we also met that guy, Shimei. Remember, Shimei was the one who was throwing rocks at David and cursing him? These guys all show up again as David is heading back into Jerusalem. Now that David is victorious, though, the whole situation has changed. No longer is he fleeing the city for his life. He's entering the city as the reigning king. And guess what? Shimei, the one who was throwing rocks and cursing, he suddenly has a totally different point of view. He lays down on the ground before David and asks for grace. Well, remember that same general, Abishai, who came to David when Shimei was throwing rocks and cursing, and Abishai said, David, let me cut his head off. Guess what Abishai does now? Same thing. David, this is nonsense. Let me kill him right here. And David's response is a shocker. In chapter 19, verse 22, David replied, what does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, which was Abishai? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel? And so the king said to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king promised him an oath. David's forgiveness, David's grace here is amazing. And then someone else shows up. It's Mephibosheth. Before, when David was fleeing the city, remember, Ziba comes out to him and here gives him food, gives him horses, and David says, where's Mephibosheth? And Ziba says, he wants to stay in the city because he's hoping that they'll make him king, because he was the grandson of the previous king Saul. Well, now Mephibosheth comes out to David as David is returning to the city. And he has a story to tell. A lot has happened, and Mephibosheth claims that everything Ziba told him back when David was fleeing the city and Ziba was being so kind, Mephibosheth said that was all a lie. He says he was dressed and ready to come, and it was Ziba who betrayed him, and then went out and lied to David. Who should David believe in this moment? Both men are standing right there in front of him. It's one man's word against another. He has no way to tell which one is saying the truth. And David says, all right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to divide the property. Remember, originally David had given all this land to Mephibosheth, and Ziba was going to steward it. Then when Ziba came out to David as he was fleeing and told David that Mephibosheth was staying in the city hoping to be made king, David said, fine, I'll give you all of Mephibosheth's land. Well, now Mephibosheth has a whole other story to tell, and David says, we're just going to divide the land, and you each get part of it. And Mephibosheth just blurts out, let Ziba have it all. I'm just glad you're back safe. It's hard to know what to believe in those moments, isn't it? Maybe Mephibosheth just wanted his place at the king's table. At the end of chapter 19, as David is still heading into the city, another person shows up to greet him. A supporter named Barzillai. And we read that Barzillai is an older gentleman who is extremely wealthy. But he wants to bless David. And it is an interaction of support and faithfulness, and it is a welcome change from everything that David has been experiencing up to this point. Finally, the king says goodbye to Barzillai, and right away he runs into more controversy. For David, it is like drama will never, ever leave him. Troops from Israel that had been fighting for Absalom are angered by the troops from Judah who had been fighting for David. Tribal loyalties start to rear their ugly heads. Tensions are running very high. I mean, this is an emotional situation. Civil war had just taken place. It's a lot like the politics that we see so much emotion, so much fighting. It's so complicated. And in this particular case, as the civil war is over and the king is headed back into the land, these two factions are fighting over which one is actually more faithfully allegiant to the king. First of all, the troops in Israel blame Judah, saying, you're stealing the king away. And the troops from Judah respond, basically, we're not stealing him away. The king is actually from our tribe. Of course we're going to be close to him. The men of Israel basically respond back, so what? We are 10 tribes. You're one. Shouldn't we have more of a claim on David than you? It's this very political back and forth at the very moment when David should be having no controversy so that he can reclaim the throne. And just as the arguing is going back and forth among his troops, a new person speaks up, someone named Sheba. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, which was of the tribe of Saul, which was aligned with the tribes of Israel that were fighting against David. He blows a trumpet and calls the soldiers from Israel to leave and join him. This is not good. At the very moment when David wants peace and things to be settled down, all of a sudden, this new leader seems to be starting trouble. It sounds like civil war is about to break out again. So without that controversy solved, David arrives back in Jerusalem to finally set things in order. His first action that he takes is he goes to those 10 concubines and he essentially puts them on house arrest. Remember how Absalom had slept with them right on top of the roof of the palace? Because of that, David chooses to never sleep with them again. They're treated essentially as widows, held in confinement for the rest of their lives, and their basic needs are cared for. But they're no longer an active part of the royal household. Next, David goes to his new general, Amasa, and asks him to summon a fighting force from the people of Judah within 3 days' time. David wants to deal with the soldiers who left to go with that betrayer, Sheba, just a little bit ago. What David is doing here is trying to forego yet another civil war. The problem is, as Amasa goes out to raise this fighting force, it takes longer than 3 days. And remember, Amasa was originally part of the rebellion. And so David starts to wonder, why is it taking him so long? Is he now betraying me? Maybe Amasa can't be trusted. Maybe I made a bad choice in allowing him to be the top general. And so David calls on his trusted general Abishai. Remember, he's the one who wanted to kill that guy Shimei, who was throwing the rocks and doing the curses. He asks Abishai to deal with this. Now notice, though, in choosing Abishai, David has not chosen his other top general, Joab, the guy who killed his son Absalom. Joab was David's general, top general, for a long time, decades. So imagine how Joab is feeling at this moment. First, he got passed over by Amasa from the rebellion. Now he gets passed over by Abishai. I think things were tense among David's military leaders. This whole situation is emotional and tense. But Abishai now leads the men who used to be under Joab's command. They leave the city and they head out, and guess who they meet? Amasa, the guy that David had chosen from the rebellion to be his top general and sent out to go muster a fighting force from Judah to go capture the rebellious Israelites under Sheba. I know, I'm mentioning a billion names right now. It's coming together, I promise. And so what do you have? You have 3 of David's top generals that all meet there in a crossroads. Amasa, Abishai, Joab. And remember, Joab is the guy who's been passed over now twice. He's a schemer. He goes up to Amasa, pretending to greet him, grabs a dagger, and stabs him in the stomach, and kills Amasa. Joab is not to be trusted. And yet, in this tense moment, Joab and Abishai together chase after Sheba and the rebellious Israelites. Sheba and his men hide out in a city, and Joab and Abishai lay siege to the city. They build siege works up. They start battering the wall with a battering ram. Just then, a wise woman from inside the city calls out for Joab and says, "What are you doing? We're a peaceful city. We've always been a peaceful city. Why are you doing this to us?" And Joab says, "They've come to get Sheba and the rebels." So the woman goes back into the city, talks it over with the leaders of the city, and they take action. They return, having cut off Sheba's head, and they throw it over the wall to Joab. This story's off the hook, right? And with that action, this long family drama is finally over. Joab has cemented his place in the military. David is back on the throne, and peace returns to the land. What in the world can we learn about friendship from this story? Chapters 16 through 20, we have heard of people who risked their neck for David to be faithful and loyal. We have heard about people who were lying, scheming, and betraying their friendship with David. In other words, when David is struggling, and he is really struggling throughout this whole scenario, he learns who his true friends are. Hushai, the advisor, is willing to be a secret agent for him. Ziba gives David provisions, but then maybe Ziba is also a liar. Joab, even though he is a schemer, totally sticks with David through the whole thing, and his strong confrontation probably shook David out of his lethargy. Abishai is loyal. Barzillai is loyal. David learns who his fair weather friends are as well. Mephibosheth doesn't come out to help David. Shimei treats David poorly in one moment and asks for grace the next. Joab kills David's son against David's wishes. Which group would your friends say you are like? The loyal friends or the fair-weather friends? Are you willing to give sacrificially to your friends? Do you stick your neck out for them when they're struggling? Do you have their back, even if it costs you something? Or do you only show your friendship when the stakes are low and there's nothing for you to risk? Genuine friendship is sacrificially generous. As Paul writes in Philippians chapter 2, he says, "Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the mindset of Christ Jesus." Is there someone in your life you need to be a better friend to? Are you known for caring for your friends, like Paul wrote? Do you look for ways to see situations from their perspective and then act accordingly, knowing that that takes effort? It takes intentional thought in the midst of our busy lives. I mean, hear what Paul said. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, consider others above yourselves. Not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Through this crazy story in King David's life, we definitely see strong friendships and unfaithful friendships. We are called to be people who give generously, sacrificially in friendship.